Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our program comparing and contrasting southern resident and Briggs killer whales in the Salish Sea. My name is Jim Britton, and I'm the vice chairperson of the board for City Club. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land we are on here today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the coastal Salish people. And it has been that way since time immemorial. If you know anyone who is going to miss this program, or you'd like to see it again, it will be available next week on our website. As always, I'd like to thank our volunteers and those who made this program possible. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their kind and generous support. Peace Health, St. Joseph Medical Center, Bruce and Claudia Descend, Danny Neal, real estate broker of the Mollyog Group, Firehouse Arts and Event Center, Colshan CPAs, the Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community Foundation, the Salish Current, Bellingham Yacht Club, and Bellingham Power Squadron. And big thanks also to our caterer today, Calypso Kitchen. And would you also please make sure that you've silenced your cell phones? And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our chair for this program and program committee chairperson and moderator for this program, Jane Bray.
Thank you, Jim, and let me extend my welcome to all of you today as well. Just how this is going to go today, we will have our speaker, and I'll introduce her in a moment. Then we have some questions that the program committee will be asking her, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So I'd ask that you keep your questions, hold them if you possibly can, really appreciate it. If there's anything that Monica says that's not, that I think might need some more clarification, I will interrupt and ask. Coming up over the next several months, we have a number of programs that we think will be of interest. One of which is a focus on misinformation and not just what we're reading about with coming elections, but also scamming and just how do we get media literate, I think is the current term that people are using. We will be looking at the expanded role of libraries, from tax preparation to social workers, to dealing with book bans. The role of libraries is very dynamic. We are working on a program about what is going on with our local libraries as well. Diversion courts and what all that means. Do they work? What's going on in Whatcom County? How does our sheriff look at this? This is another program that's coming. We have a program planned for water adjudication, whatever the heck that is for those of us who don't speak the language. Basically, it's who gets what water, including fish, and how is it going to be apportioned and how that decision is going to be made. No complexity there. And we are looking at a program on the Bolt decision that happened 50 years ago. And while that addressed the impacts on the tribes, the impacts nationally, as well as here in Bellingham, for example, the coal terminal some years ago, are really profound, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So stay tuned. We will let you know when things are coming. Today's program One moment, please. Whoops. Started when a friend gave me Monica's book, who's actually a mutual friend with Monica, and I started reading it about orcas, and as a voter, I thought, whoa, this is something that would be really interesting to the City Club. So if you have those kinds of epiphanies, but ooh, this is a topic that would be of interest to the City Club, please let us know, because we're always interested in that information. So let me take a moment and welcome and introduce our speaker, Monica Whelan Shields. She is the co-founder and director of the Orca Behavior Institute, a nonprofit based in San Juan Island. Their mission is to inspire conservation of wild killer whales through non-invasive research, bold advocacy, and science-based education. Monica has been observing and studying orcas in the Salish Sea since 2000. She knows Salish Sea killer whales on a personal level, having gotten to know them and their family histories through hundreds of encounters. She regularly shares her stories through blogs, social media posts, and photography. Monica has helped document dramatic shifts in both the endangered fish-eating southern residents and the thriving mammal-eating big killer whales. Her peer-reviewed scientific publications cover topics including acoustic communication, shifting habitat usage, and behavior of regional killer whales. She's also in the book Endangered Orcas, the story of the southern residents. And I'd like to welcome Monica.
All right, mic good to go? Perfect. Thank you everyone for being here today. And thank you for that lovely introduction. If you're following the media stories that we see in the region here about killer whales, they can often seem a little bit conflicting because on one hand, we hear about how the pods are struggling. They're not coming in as much as they used to. Their population is declining. But on the other hand, we also hear about killer whales that are thriving, and we're having record sightings of killer whales in this local waters. And so it can be confusing if you're not well versed in the orcas of this region to kind of hold on to both those things at the same time because they're both true. And so today I want to give you kind of an overview and introduction to these two different populations of orcas that we're lucky enough to have as our neighbors here in the Salish Sea. Their stories are very different but very intertwined with one another, and we're really pretty lucky to have them both here because we can compare and contrast what the differences are between these two populations. So my story in the San Juan Islands started in the early 2000s. We had been on a family trip to Alaska. I was a young teenager. We saw orcas within the wild for the first time, and it was love at first sight. And so we came back to Portland, Oregon, where I grew up, and I wanted to know if there was anywhere closer to home where I could see killer whales. And that's when I learned about the San Juan Islands and the southern residents. And so a few years later, we came on another family trip up to the San Juans, and I met the southern residents. And yet again, it was a changing, a turning point in my life because I knew this is where I want to be. I want to get to know these whales better. This is a magical place, and I want to learn everything I can about them. So the whales that I met were those fish-eating southern residents, J-pod, K-pod, and L-pod. And in the early 2000s, they were doing what they had done for decades, probably centuries prior, of coming in, following the abundant salmon that were returning in the summer months, primarily to the Fraser River near Vancouver, BC. And they would kind of do a circuit around the San Juan Islands. We would see them on almost a daily basis off the west side of San Juan Island at Limestone Point State Park. That's where this photo was taken. I'm down there on the rocks, as close to the whales as I can be, my favorite place. But it was all about the southern residents. And I had heard about this other population, but actually hadn't seen them or encountered them for the first few years that I was up there. So I started as a research intern doing acoustics research at the Whale Museum. I eventually went on and started working as a naturalist on a whale watching vessel and basically just started spending more and more time on San Juan Island as I was able to. But now things have shifted completely. We have this other population of whales, these mammal-eating whales that were originally called transients. as sort of a contrast to the residents. So the residents would come into the area, stay for weeks or months at a time feeding on salmon, and then would roam from there. But the transients at this time would just transit through. We would see them for 1 day, maybe 2 days. There would be weeks in between sightings. So we wouldn't encounter them very much at all. But things have flipped entirely. And because the name transient isn't as accurate anymore, there's been a movement to call them Biggs killer whales in honor of the pioneering researcher Michael Bigg, who was a Canadian scientist that first determined you could individually identify the orcas based on their natural markings. So I may use the term transient and Biggs interchangeably, but they're both referring to this mammal-eating population, while Southern Residents refers to this fish-eating population. And I wore a lot of different hats in the whale community over the years as I found a way to move to and live on San Juan Island. I got a degree in biology with a focus in animal behavior and did an undergraduate thesis on killer whale acoustic communication. I continued to write and share stories and photos about the whales, but I was missing the scientific connection. And in 2013, we had a dramatic shift in what we were seeing in the San Juan Islands, where suddenly the Southern Residents weren't there in the summer anymore. And when they did come in, we were no longer seeing the big gatherings of all the pods together. We weren't seeing as much socializing or resting behavior. And simultaneous to this, we were starting to see this rise of the Biggs. I had spent 4 years on San Juan Island before I ever saw a Biggs killer whale in the early 2000s. And now, starting around 2013, I was starting to see them even more than I had seen Southern Residents. And in part to help document some of these changes that we were starting to see, we founded the Orca Behavior Institute, our nonprofit on San Juan Island. Since we live there full time, we're a small group that has a science background, we thought, let's start collecting some data on these changes that we're seeing so we can get this information out to policymakers and managers and help document the changes and hopefully put protections in place for both populations based on how they're utilizing the habitat now. And so our organization has grown to do not only research, but educational events like these. We run some adult science classes that do deeper dives into whale research, and then also advocacy, chiming in when there's any legislation that affects regional killer whales or other kind of policy making comment periods. And so like I mentioned, these formerly transient killer whales aren't so transient anymore. I had 4 years of amazing encounters with Southern Residents on the west side of San Juan Island. And if you've ever had the luck of seeing whales from shore there, they come right off the shoreline within just a few feet. It's an incredible experience, unlike any other that you can have with a top predator. But this was my first photo of a transient killer whale, and I was so excited because I finally saw one after 4 years, and they really did exist. And at that point in time, I think this was 2004, I never could have imagined that encounters like these would become the new normal, where we're seeing now these transient or Biggs killer whales traversing, the San Juan Islands and the entirety of the Salish Sea in numbers that we couldn't have imagined even 15 years ago. And so even within the Orca Behavior Institute, we started in 2015. This is looking at our field research encounters from May through September. So simply the number of times we see each of these populations in the field. The Southern Residents are in light blue, and the T's refers to the Biggs killer whales or transients in dark blue. And even since we founded as an organization, you can see how dramatically our encounters with these two populations have changed. Our first season, from the months of May through September, we had over 60 encounters with the Southern Residents, and we had 3 encounters with Biggs killer whales. Now in 2023, last season, we barely broke 20 encounters with Southern Residents over that time period and had over 100 encounters with Biggs killer whales in that same time period. So just gives you a sense of how dramatic and how quick this shift has been. But backing up a little bit, it's important to put these two populations in context. So killer whales are a species that are still considered the same species, Orcinus orca, all throughout the world. But scientists have recognized that taxonomically, They're what we consider a species complex, where there's all these subpopulations, potentially even multiple species within what we're still calling killer whales. And so for now, we use the term ecotype for the different populations that are found really in every ocean of the world. And it's kind of a stand-in until we sort of figure out taxonomically more what's going on. Some of these populations have been well studied, like our residents and bigs in local waters, and others are very little known. But what's really remarkable is this is kind of a genetic history of some of the most commonly encountered and most well-known populations of orcas throughout the world. They range from here in the Pacific to the Atlantic to the Antarctic. And what's really remarkable is that our resident and transient ecotypes, even though they live in the same geographic area here, are among the most genetically distinct of any killer whale populations that are found anywhere in the world. So they're sharing this one habitat here, but they are not interbreeding or interacting with one another at all. And this is something that genetics suggests goes back over 700,000 years, that this has been two separate populations living in these same waters. And as we talk about residents and transients, I think it's also important to mention that there are multiple populations within each of these ecotypes. We're focused here on the southern residents that are found in Washington state. They do range from BC down to central California. And then our population of the mammal-eating killer whales is the West Coast transients that share almost an identical range. But as you go kind of north across the Pacific Basin, there are other populations of fish-eating and mammal-eating orcas. And the term resident and transient is unique to the North Pacific here. So there are fish-eating and mammal-eating killer whales elsewhere in the world that are not called residents and transients. But throughout the entire Northeast Pacific here, we have these multiple populations of fish eaters and mammal eaters. And so resident and transient are the ecotypes, but we're focused in on the specific populations here in the Salish Sea of the southern residents and the West Coast transients. And this map here shows that the ranges entirely overlap. So in pink there is where the resident killer whales tend to travel, and the dark purple is where the transient killer whales tend to travel. So in terms of what these two populations have in common, they're all considered Orcinus orca, the same species, at least for now. They have the exact same geographic range, and they're all given alphanumeric designations. So because these whales have been so well studied over the last 40 or 50 years, we know both these populations on an individual level. Every whale has been photo-identified and given a number by scientists, and we know several decades of their family history in terms of the births and deaths. But beyond that, pretty much everything else about them is different, from their genetics, morphology, diet, acoustics, social structure, behavior. Basically everything about who they are is different. And so I'm going to walk through some examples of that today. But first, I had mentioned that the stories of both these ecotypes are very different. And so this is a graph that's looking at the population trajectory over the last 11 or 12 years or so for both these populations. So that's number of whales is what's being indicated by each line here. And you can see that the southern residents have pretty much flatlined at about 75 whales. Their population has been declining slightly, definitely has not been increasing, and that goes back over the last 15 to 20 years. Whereas the Biggs killer whale population numbered, about 280 individuals in 2012, and currently numbers over 380 individuals. So that's a population increase of over 100 whales within the last, decade plus. So again, very different stories playing out. And that Biggs killer whale population, that population number is just referring to our intercoastal population. There's also an outer coastal section of the population that roams pelagically that we don't get here in our inland waters. And if you add those whales in, the mammal-eating West Coast transient population totals over 600 whales compared to just 75 of our southern resident killer whales. But I mentioned both types are given these alphanumeric designations, so J-pod, K-pod, and L-pod for our fish-eating killer whales. And what a pod is essentially an extended family group that travels together the vast majority of the time. So within J-pod, we have several of what we call matrilines, which are a female and her immediate offspring. So we talk about the J14s, the J22s, the J11s, and so on. And so within JPOD, we have 6 of these related matrilines that all travel together as one unit. So if JPOD is coming through the area, most of the time we're seeing right now 26 whales in that population, all traveling together as a single pod. For the Biggs killer whales, they don't really have that same pod structure. They travel in individual matrilines of just a single female and her offspring. So we talk about something like the T38As, which is just a mom and one offspring, so a unit of 2, or the T41s is a unit of just 4 whales. So they tend to travel in these much smaller groups. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But when we're talking about some of these individual whales, we say something like J14, that means she was the 14th whale identified in JPOD. The T for the Biggs killer whales comes from transient. And they're given numbers that then alternate with kind of letters to indicate the birth order. So T38 is one of the first individuals that was identified. T38A is her first offspring, A for the first one. And then you can see T38A's first offspring is T38A1. So their designations kind of code their matrilineal history within their alphanumeric designation because they don't stay together in these pod units. So it's more difficult to kind of track and trace their family history over time. So it's kind of done through these alphanumerics. And morphologically, these both look like a typical killer whale on the surface. These are young males from each population. They've got that tall black dorsal fin. They have a gray marking behind the fin called a saddle patch. They have eye patches and kind of the white belly markings. And in general, most orcas share that standard coloration, but there are some subtle differences that help to tell them apart as well. So for our resident killer whales, we're looking at more rounded dorsal fins. They also have a lot more variety in their saddle patches. They have solid saddle patches that are kind of uniform gray. They also have, we call this a finger, where there's kind of a little bit that's sticking up off the top of the saddle patch. They have open saddle patches where black goes down inside that gray marking. So lots of variability in those saddle patch markings. And then their eye patch tends to be very rounded, and it's parallel to sort of the line of their back. Whereas for the transient killer whales, their dorsal fins tend to be a lot more triangular, especially at the tip. Their saddle patches are always solid. They don't have open saddle patches or fingers, but they tend to have a lot more rake marks, kind of scratches across their saddles, and that comes both from one another and from their prey, which fights back. And then their eye patches are sort of at a 45-degree angle relative to their back, and they tend to be a little bit more kind of unusual in their shape as well. And so when we encounter whales in the field, these are some of the morphological features that we can look at to determine which population we're encountering, as well as that group size clue. If we see a group of 25 plus whales, it's a good guess that it's probably residents. If we see a group of 2 or 3 whales, it's a good guess that it's probably the Biggs killer whales.
Monica?
Yeah.
Could you define morphology, please?
Yeah, morphology is just what the animal looks like. So their physical characteristics and how we describe them. But they don't just look different and travel in different group sizes. The way that they move through their habitat is completely different as well. So this is a map of the Salish Sea with the San Juan Islands kind of right in the middle there. And when JPOD comes in, they have this very standard route that they take. They usually come in from out west at the open ocean through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. They have a route they take up the larger straits, Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass towards the mouth of the Fraser River. They often loop down Rosario Strait and come back through the San Juan Islands. And it's kind of this typical figure 8 that we expect them to make. And this is because they're historically following the fish that are returning up to the Fraser River. So they're staying in the large straits and channels that the fish usually travel in. And they would kind of follow one group of fish up to the river, loop around, meet the next group of fish, do the same thing again. And so they're much more predictable in their travel routes. This is The second animation here shows what a small group of bigs, the T65Bs, did over the same couple of days that JPOD made that circuit. And they go into every little nook and cranny. Basically, if there's blue on the map, that's a place where you can see Big's killer whales. They go in the big channels, they go in the little channels, they go into every little bay, every small channel, but we sometimes get them inside the breakwater of marinas. And that all has to do with what they're eating. They're looking for seals, sea lions, porpoises. Sometimes they're out in open water. Sometimes they're under the docks in a marina. Sometimes they're by a little rocky outcropping. And so the way they move through their habitat is completely different. So if you see orcas, inside a marina or going through a very narrow channel, like if they're down in Hood Canal or Saanich Inlet or something like that, in all likelihood, it's the mammal-eating killer whales versus the fish eaters that tend to stick to the more open channels. So let's take a look at their diet in a little more detail. Big's killer whales are focusing more on our small marine mammals. The population that we have here, they're not the ones that are eating gray whales and humpback whales. That happens more on the outer coast, especially in California and in Alaska. But more than 50% of their diet is harbor seals. Their other top prey items locally are harbor porpoise, Steller sea lion, and Dall's porpoise. Whereas for our fish-eating whales, at least when they're in the inland waters in the summer months, the vast majority of their diet is Chinook salmon. So they're not eating anything other than fish, and over 90% or over 95% of their diet is some type of salmonid species. So Chinook is their favorite. In the fall, as we get into kind of October, November, December, they shift a little bit to feeding on chum salmon. But for the most part, it's Chinook, the biggest, kind of fattiest, biggest bang for their buck that they're after. So no overlap in the diet between these two populations at all. And really that dictates everything else that's different about them. The reason, I mentioned how they move through their habitats based on their prey, but their social association and group structure is related to that as well, where the large groups of resident killer whales can feed on abundant salmon, and they can be 30 whales all vocalizing and surface active and moving through the environment, together. And historically, there was enough fish for all those whales, and the fish don't really react to killer whale calls or splashes at the surface, so they can be their boisterous selves and feed on fish. But the Big's killer whales are stealth predators, so they tend to passively listen for their prey. They move through their environment very quietly, and if you're going to sneak up on something as sharp as a seal or a sea lion that's very aware of their environment, listening to their environment, you're more successful at doing that if you're in a small group. So having 3 to 5 whales is much more efficient for hunting marine mammals than having 30 whales. And we're actually at a point in the Salish Sea where our local marine mammal populations can all tell the difference between resident and transient killer whales. So we see seals, sea lions, porpoises, all of them, they will swim in and among resident killer whales, no problem. But if they detect the Big's killer whales, they are out of there. So they have learned the same things we use to determine which population we're seeing. All of our local marine mammal populations have learned those cues as well. And I wanted to at least play an example for you on what these two populations sound like, because they essentially have 2 different languages that they use to communicate. They don't have any vocalizations that overlap between the populations. They use echolocation clicks to kind of navigate and make their way through their environment. They have whistles that are more common in other dolphin species and just occur occasionally in orcas. But their main social vocalization are what we call discrete calls. And the southern residents are known for being the super chatty ones. They're vocalizing about 80% of the time. They have over 25 different call types that are then subdivided into unique repertoires for each pod. So we can tell that we're listening not only to southern residents, but we can tell if we're listening to J-pod, K-pod, or L-pod based on their acoustics alone. And this is what they sound like. And before somebody asks, I'll tell you 40 plus years of research, we have no idea what they're saying. So, but the transient killer whales are silent most of the time. I would say easily 90% plus of the time we drop a hydrophone in their vicinity and they're completely silent. Again, they're hunting by stealth. They do a lot of opportunistic feeding. The only time we see them vocalizing is usually after they've made a kill and they're sharing that food with their group, so they've already got the food that they need. Or sometimes they get together in these big groups that we affectionately call tea parties, where we get multiple matrilines together and we may have 15 or 20 whales together, and it's more about social behavior at that point in time than foraging, and so they vocalize then as well. But even with an untrained ear, you'll hear how different these guys sound. And for some reason, all of their vocalizations have that kind of vibrato quality to them. Like they just sound very eerie compared to the very chipper southern residents.
Monica, do the transients, since they are mammal eating, ever try to eat the locals?
Oh, the local, do the transients ever try to eat the local resident killer whales? Not that we've ever seen, but they don't seem to particularly like each other. So if they're in the same waterway, what we actually see is the transients tend to diverge away from the southern residents. And we think that's because they can hear them, because they're chatty. And so the residents probably often don't even know there are transients in the area, but it's the mammal eaters that will change course and go in a different direction to avoid the residents. If they do come into close range, we often see the residents chase the transients out of the area. And our best theory for that is that they do pose a threat, especially to like juvenile resident killer whales. But because the residents travel in larger groups, there are probably enough of them to kind of chase the smaller transient groups out of the area. So for the most part, they completely ignore each other, but if there is any interaction, it's the transients giving way to the residents. So the southern residents are probably the most well-known population of whales in the world, due to many reasons, including the movie Free Willy, where the residents were actually featured in the opening and closing clips of that movie. And Willie, the fictional whale in the movie, was considered a member of J-Pod from the Salish Sea. So that was, a film that brought a lot of people to the story of the southern residents. And I get so many people that, either take classes or are interested in interning with us. And almost the first thing, everybody says is, well, I'm a Free Willy kid. And so the impact it's had on my generation is incredible. But the whales themselves have really created a bond with people as well. This is J1 Ruffles and J2 Granny that you may have heard of. They were among the most iconic members of the southern resident population for many years. Members of J-Pod that have since passed away, but were the oldest living male and female in the population. J1 lived to be 60 years old, and Granny is thought to have lived to be over 100 years old. So lifespans very similar to humans in a lot of ways, but because we know these whales as individuals, we can connect with their stories and their life histories in a way that we can't do with a lot of wild animal populations. And then, of course, more recently, as the population has been struggling, we've had these challenges and kind of these horrific stories that have come up, like J35 Tahlequah, who carried her deceased calf for 17 days in 2018. And that brought international media attention to the plight of the southern residents in a way that we've never seen. But people are connecting to these whales not just because they're a magnificent species, but because we connect to their stories as individuals. And personally, one way that has played out to me is, we're not supposed to pick favorites, but I have one. J41 Eclipse is that little calf in the top photo, and she became my favorite because when I saw her in 2005, she was just 2 days old, the tiniest killer whale I still have ever seen. And so it was just a beautiful, glassy, calm encounter out at Limekiln on San Juan Island. And she became kind of my special whale. And because I met her when she was born, I've had this amazing opportunity to watch her grow up. So 3 years later, she's still swimming right next to her mother, but grown a lot. And then I happened to be on the water in 2016, where now she's the mom, and she had her first calf. And she actually became the youngest documented mother on record at just 11 years old. So we form these personal relationships with these whales where we have these glimpses into their lives and we follow their stories over time. And that's made the southern residents very personable whales. And until recently, the Biggs killer whales were much more unknown. And the name transient honestly didn't help. A lot of people, they come out here and they're like, oh, are we gonna go see those homeless whales? But now that they're here in the way that they are and the numbers that they are and spending the amount of time here, we're getting to know them on the same level that we've known the southern residents for decades. And I wanted to highlight just one example. T46 is a very special matriarch. She was part of the last live capture of killer whales in Washington State in Budd Inlet in 1976. It was a very publicly witnessed capture that led to a lot of protest. And as a result of that, the whales, including T46, were eventually released. But she indicates to me the impact that a single whale can have on the population. Because when I went to draw out her family tree, I was like, well, she's had a couple offspring and some of them are starting to have offspring. So she probably has, a fairly decent group of descendants. But she has over 24 living descendants. So just, one successfully reproductive female can have a mark like that on the overall trajectory of a population. So none of these other whales would exist had she been taken into captivity in 1976. But if a family tree looked like this among the resident killer whales, all of these whales would travel together as a unit of 20-something whales. But what we see instead with the Biggs killer whales is when their family groups get too large, they split off into those smaller groups to keep kind of their ideal hunting size. So what would have been a single population or a single group for the residents is actually broken out into all these different matrilines that travel as independent units. There's even one individual that travels as a lone individual. So it's actually something like 6 different groups that are all part of this one family. And so that's part of what we're seeing as well, is not only are the transients spending more time here, but as their population is growing, it's splitting into all these groups. And where 30 years ago, we might have had 20 different family groups that were seen over the course of the year in the Salish Sea, in 2023, we had over 100 different Biggs family groups seen here in the Salish Sea. So they're just kind of multiplying in all senses of the word. And we're getting a chance to know these whales as individuals as well. So in 2011, a mother and her adult son live stranded on a mudflat near Prince Rupert, BC. They chased seal in at low tide and got stuck and had to wait for the next tidal cycle. But they survived it and are both still members of our population today. T46C2 is a little individual. She's at 4 years old, got stuck and separated from her family and ended up in a little inlet in BC. She had to be kind of rescued and led out of that place where she was stuck, and she ended up reuniting with other killer whales, and she's now still a successful member of our population. And then a few years ago, you may have heard about our rare white whale here. We had a young whale known as Talook that had a rare genetic condition where his pigmentation made his body very light gray instead of black. And while unfortunately part of that genetic condition was also had immune system effects, he has not survived. But these are just 3 examples from this extended family group of how we're getting to know these whales as individuals the way we've known the southern residents as individuals for decades. So let's talk a little bit about how this big change that I've talked about. This is looking at the number of days each population was seen in the Salish Sea going back to 2006, just in those kind of summer months from April through September when we have the most eyes on the water. And the darker line here is our southern resident killer whale population. And you can see that big dip in 2013 that I talked about, where between April and September, we used to have them here about 130 days over that several month time span. And that's now dropped to, about 50 days of presence over the same time period. And the bigs trend, almost exactly the opposite. 2006, 2007, we were only seeing them maybe 30 days out of the entire summer. And now they're basically here every single day in that time period. Over 180 days each year, they are somewhere in the Salish Sea. And so what that looks like is like this. So this is one of our sightings maps. We put out these monthly and annual maps tracking all whale sightings or orca sightings throughout the Salish Sea. And this is our 2021 map for southern residents. And each of the different colored dots indicates a different season. And this looks like a decent number of dots. We had over 120 sightings of southern residents that year, but it was actually a record low in terms of the number of times they were seen in the Salish Sea. And you really get the contrast when you put the Biggs killer whale map right next to it. So this one is showing not only different colors as different seasons, but the size of the circle is showing the group size as well. So you can see that they're also beginning to congregate in larger groups. And I keep thinking, surely they can't go any higher. So 2021, this map represents over 1,000 individual big sightings. 2023, we had over 1,400 individual big sightings. So they just keep going up. And the reason for this is all linked back to prey. So the specific details of where this data come from aren't super important in this context. I just want to draw your attention to kind of these trends. So this line is showing the number of sightings of Biggs killer whales, from a period of 2002 to 2014. There was a big spike in 2005 because the pod spent several months in Hood Canal, but overall kind of an upward trajectory in their presence here. And if we overlay some of WDFW's harbor porpoise density data with that, it's very similar. We're seeing an increase in not only porpoise, but seals and sea lions as well. So abundant food bringing in these marine mammal predators in numbers we haven't seen before. And the exact opposite is what's playing out for the southern residents. So comparing this first lighter line to the left axis here, this is again, number of days that southern residents were present in the spring months from April through June. On the right axis, that's the number of spring Chinook salmon escapement on the Fraser River over that same time period. Again, this overall drop that correlates directly with the southern residents having to move elsewhere. So the take-home message is, the primary factor driving these changes in presence has to do with the thriving marine mammal populations and the struggling salmon populations. And the way that this plays out for individual whales is a bit heartbreaking. If you're not getting enough to eat, you have difficulty, maintaining the nutritional status necessary to carry a calf to full term. And we know from the dedicated studies on the southern residents that 2/3 of the pregnancies end in miscarriage. And that is directly related to the nutritional status of the mother. Biggs killer whales, on the other hand, we expect orcas to reproduce about once every 5 years because it's an 18-month gestation period followed by 2 years of nursing. But you can see this other individual, just the same age as J31 up top, she had 5 births by the age of 25, and in a couple cases, she gave birth just 2 years apart, meaning that she was both pregnant and nursing at the same time. So they're getting not only enough to sustain themselves and reproduce, but this incredible metabolic toll on the mother. She's pregnant, she's nursing, and she also has 3 other juveniles she's feeding, and she's traveling by herself doing most of that hunting to feed all of those whales. So kind of a heartbreaking story for the residents is just this incredible story to witness for these super moms in Biggs killer whales. And at a population level, this is looking at the number of births from 2013 to 2023. So 21 calves have been born into the southern resident population over that time period, with 16 of them still alive today, versus 155 calves born into the Biggs population, with 142 of them still alive today. So in the last 10 years, we've essentially had twice as many Biggs killer whales born into the population as there are southern resident killer whales. So just the comparisons between these two populations just get more remarkable with every passing year. And looking at what that means, in terms of reproduction, we're seeing over those 10, 11 years, just 0.6 calves being born per reproductive southern resident female versus 1.7 calves born per reproductive Biggs killer whale. So almost a 3 times higher birth rate in the Biggs killer whale population. So we have these two populations sharing this one habitat, and both are species that have received protections. And when we talk about killer whales in the Salish Sea, there's sort of 3 primary risk factors that often get talked about. One is contaminants, especially kind of bioaccumulating contaminants like PCBs, PBDEs, DDT, things like that work their way up the food web. And the higher you are on the food chain, the more of these contaminants accumulate in your body. So the Biggs killer whales are actually 1 level higher on the food web. They're eating mammals that are eating salmon versus the southern residents that are eating salmon directly. So the Biggs are actually carrying much higher toxin loads than the southern residents are. But again, if you're getting enough to eat, you're carrying those toxins in your blubber, but you're not metabolizing them. And so they're not affecting your fertility and your immune system the way that we see in the southern resident population. So the southern residents, it's probably a factor that's contributing to their low reproductive rates, the death of individuals at a young age. They're more susceptible to illness. So again, if they had more food, the contaminants would be less of an issue. The other risk factor that receives a lot of attention is vessel effects, and this is primarily through underwater noise, and it can be everything from recreational vessels to shipping traffic and ferries to military testing exercises, all of that kind of thing. And there's been a lot that's been done on the front of trying to make the oceans quieter for the southern residents, to have ship slowdowns in some of the main corridors that the whales travel. The vessel regulations for small vessels have become very restrictive in both the US and Canada around southern residents to help mitigate some of these impacts. But again, you could make the ocean completely quiet, and if there's not enough fish out there to sustain the whales, that part's not going to matter. And we see that with the Biggs killer whale population. They're subject to the same underwater noise, but because there's a harbor seal around every corner out here, if they miss one, it doesn't matter because they'll just get the next one. So you've probably got my message by now that it all comes down to prey. All of these factors are important, and they're all things that we need to address. But until we address the salmon issue for the southern residents, we're not going to see the population recovery the way that we've seen with Biggs killer whales. So what can we do? The southern residents were listed as endangered in 2005. And in the almost 20 years now since then, like I mentioned, there's been a lot of attention on what we can do to help these whales. And a lot of the things that have been put into place are good things for our ecosystem as a whole. But we still have yet to address some of these biggest ticket items that relate to salmon recovery. And the reason for that is because they're incredibly complicated, they're very political, there's a lot of different stakeholders involved, and these are the hard ones. And I think that's why we haven't been able to tackle them yet. So it includes things like dam breaching, especially the lower Snake River dams, fisheries management. So southern residents aren't really given a piece of the pie when fishing projections are kind of divvied up. We consider the human fishermen, but we're not considering the number of fish that the southern residents need when we're having those conversations. There's also issues in Alaska where they're taking mixed stock fisheries. So we have for a long time thought of Alaska as kind of the sustainable source of salmon, but turns out they're catching a lot of our Washington and BC salmon up in those waters, and so that is a very complicated issue. Fish farms, especially in BC, have been a huge issue where the aquaculture industry in the water is introducing a lot of disease to wild salmon, and just freshwater habitat restoration in all its forms, looking at logging and agriculture and all the impacts on salmon spawning streams. So it's tough stuff, but we're kind of at the point where we need to decide, are we going to live in an environment where we can have not just one but two successful apex predator populations as our neighbors? The southern residents are hanging on. I don't think they're past the breaking point yet, but they're definitely getting close as their population continues to go down. But what we've seen, 2015 was a really hopeful year where salmon runs were sort of artificially inflated due to some extra hatchery releases that year, and we saw 11 southern resident births in 13 months. So they have shown us that if we can get them the food, they are capable of having the births and helping the population kind of turn around and recover. But that is sort of the challenge that we face. And so hopefully this has been a great introduction to these two amazing populations of orcas and how their stories are similar but so very different here in the Salish Sea. So thank you.
Wonderful. My head is breaking with all this information. A few questions that the program committee put together. We want to go back to the vessel traffic issue. As I know and some of you may know, there is a proposal in British Columbia to increase or add something called the Roberts Bank terminal proposal, which would increase traffic by 30%. And given that vessel noise is an issue, maybe not the top of, but by 30% increase, what might be done to mitigate that issue?
Yeah, that is a huge topic that's going to have impacts on the southern residents for sure. I think even within the topic of vessel effects, we often focus on the small vessels because that's what we see closer to the whales more often. But it's really the big, tankers and cargo ships that transit the waters that have the greatest acoustic impact on the whales. Small vessels, when they're operating at high speed, tend to move through an area in a couple of minutes. Then small vessels operating at slow speeds, their engine noise is similar to the ambient noise underwater. But when a tanker transits Harrow Strait, for instance, on the west side of San Juan Island, they're audible for at least 30 minutes, and it's exactly overlapping the frequencies that the whales use to communicate and navigate and forage. So the tankers and the cargo ships are a huge issue. And one way that they've addressed that to this point is with these voluntary slowdowns, where they're asking the ships to slow down their transit. So even though they're in the area longer, it reduces the amplitude of the noise they're putting into the water pretty remarkably. And they have a very high compliance rate, even though it's voluntary. I think it's something like 80% of the ships have participated in it. And so they're working in that respect to make the waters quieter for the whales in the seasons that we expect them to be in those major waterways. But you increase the number of ships by 30%, that's absolutely going to reduce the acoustic space available to the whales to navigate. Not to mention the increased risk of a catastrophic oil spill that comes with that as well. So this is an issue that we as orca advocates are paying super close attention to. It has been approved in Canada, but it's being litigated, and we're watching it very closely.
Thank you. Speaking of contaminants, is that on? Okay. We understand that a grad student at University of British Columbia explored the contamination from wildfires and smoke runoff, PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Is this a new contaminant, and what do we know about the effect on mammals?
Yeah, it is a new contaminant that we're, at least in terms of us looking at it in marine mammals. The research at this point is pretty preliminary, but it's not at all surprising, that we see that type of contaminant. What is interesting from that particular study is that it's the mammal-eating Biggs killer whales that show more of the wildfire smoke signature of like burning wood and the toxins from that. And the the resident killer whales show more of sort of hydrocarbon burning, and that probably has to do with them spending more time in kind of an urban environment. So even within the PAHs, they show kind of a different signature between the two populations, but it's very new research. We don't really know yet what the potential health impacts of that sort of thing might be, but it's not surprising. Pretty much any contaminant that we start looking for in the whales, we find it. They live in such an urban environment that they're encountering all of this stuff, and it's important to keep in mind, that one, not just it's affecting everything in the sea, but if it's in them, it's almost certainly in us as well. And so important stuff to pay attention to.
PAHs are carcinogenic, by the way. You talked about many of the threats that are here now that you've seen historically. What about other threats that might be longer term? I mean, new things that are coming, thinking in terms of some of the things that are going on with climate, for example.
Yeah, well, climate change and ocean acidification are going to have huge impacts on wild salmon runs, which are going to then impact, southern residents as well. And so in terms of salmon recovery, there are so many stocks and rivers and streams, and I think it's really important from a conservation perspective that we focus on those that will have the most climate resilience long term. That's one reason the focus has been on the lower Snake River dams specifically, because they're very high elevation salmon habitats that are relatively pristine. And so the thought is that they're one of the better stocks that could survive some of the climate changes that we're facing. And in terms of other upcoming threats or new threats, the toxins, it's as soon as we, ban DDT, we find out about PCBs and start looking at that. And so there's all these things that we're using that maybe haven't been studied yet that could have long-term health impacts on the whales. And they're very long-term problems because it can take decades to get these, legacy contaminants out of the environment. So that's kind of an ongoing one. And then I mentioned it briefly at the end, oil spills. We had a bit of a scare 2022 now, where a fishing vessel sunk on the west side of San Juan Island with 2,200 gallons of diesel on board and was leaking. And the very afternoon the ship sunk, it was one of our rare visits from almost the entire southern resident killer whale population. And it became apparent very quickly that we were not at all prepared to handle that situation, to try to deter the whales from the area, to try and contain the spill. It was a real eye-opener, and we were incredibly lucky that the whales happened to do a 180 and leave before they encountered the diesel. But that was what's considered a very small spill. If we're talking about one of these cargo ships or tankers, where it would be a catastrophic, potentially extinction level event for the southern residents. And as I've dived into this issue further since the sinking of the fishing vessel, it's become really apparent that there's a lot of funding available for oil spill response and basically zero funding available for oil spill prevention. And that includes training. We have a community of whale researchers on San Juan Island. We have vessels that would be ready to respond and do some of this oil spill response, but there's no resources to run the training to even get crews ready to be able to respond. And so that's been a real eye-opener as kind of a new, not a new threat, but one that we're starting to pay more attention to.
Okay. Are there any, the orcas exist all over the world. Are there other examples where pods have been threatened and they have recovered? Is there anything to learn from other places?
Yeah, good question. We are still learning and uncovering new orca populations throughout the world. So we're very lucky to know them as well as we do here, because that's not the case in most places. We do know of some other very small orca populations that are basically, unfortunately, kind of doomed to extinction at this point. There's a small group of orcas in the Shetland Islands that has just 2 adult males remaining in the population. And there's a small group of transient killer whales up in Alaska known as the AT1 transients that were strongly influenced by the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And there's only adult males and post-reproductive females among the 7 whales remaining in that population. So we haven't seen any of those on the brink of extinction recover. They're kind of the warning stories of what we could be facing, here if we don't take action. But I will say one hopeful story came after the live captures that happened here in Washington State. So we removed dozens of animals for display in marine aquaria in the 1960s and 1970s from both the southern resident and northern resident killer whale populations, as well as from the Biggs killer whale population. And once the capture stopped, all three populations increased from there, including the southern residents. The southern residents declined again as salmon have crashed since then, but the northern resident and Biggs killer whale populations continue to grow. So we do have examples of recognizing what we're doing, mitigating that, and seeing recovery.
What's your favorite social interaction that you've had with any of the whales?
Yeah, we wonder all the time sort of how aware they are of us, and sometimes there are moments of mutual curiosity that are really amazing. The first one that always comes to mind is one of the early 2000s, a summer evening out at Limekiln. It was sunset, and a small group of L-pod whales, known as the L12 subgroup, were coming back south through Harrow Strait. And one juvenile male from that group, L85 Mystery, broke off from the whales, and he came right over to where we were on the rocks at Limekiln. It was the only stretch of coastline for miles where there were people. And he came straight to us, and he started vocalizing into the air for about 3 or 4 minutes. And what are you trying to tell us? We're not supposed to anthropomorphize to that degree, but it sure felt like he was trying to communicate something to us, and we, couldn't communicate back to him. And I thought it was so appropriate that it was the whale named Mystery that did that, because it remains this total mystery of what he was doing or what he was trying to say. But we have these, brief magical moments like that where they're a highly complex, intelligent, social creature, and sometimes they do reach out and try to make contact. And I think we're woefully prepared to interact with them in a way that they find interesting. But that's one of my most memorable ones.
We'll get to the others in just a second, but one of my favorite observances in your book that just blew me away was the observance of a newborn calf that had evidence of having been, that the mother had been helped by other whales during a difficult delivery. And I wonder, other than humans, are there other species that help in birth? I mean, can you enlighten us about this one?
Yeah, dolphins in general, because of their tight-knit family groups, they assist each other in all aspects of life. And it is thought that either daughters or aunts or sisters will assist a mother in birth, especially if it's a difficult birth. And so this was a case, it's speculation on our part, but when the calf was first seen, she was incredibly covered in rake marks, which are teeth marks from other killer whales. And her dorsal fin, in utero, the dorsal fins are flat basically, and they pop up about a day or two after birth, and she had a damaged dorsal fin for a while. And so our speculation was that maybe it was a more difficult birth, and that the other whales helped pull her out, and that sort of thing. So we see such small glimpses into their lives that I'm sure things like this happen all the time, and we can just kind of piece together parts of the story. But another really heartwarming story that shows that similar caretaking behavior is from a family group of our Biggs killer whales called the T2Cs. And there was a juvenile male in that family group who had scoliosis. And he wasn't able to swim at the regular orca speed. And he also wasn't able to swim to the point where he could participate in hunting. And his family would travel slower than everybody else so that he could keep up. And if they got ahead of him, they would stop and wait for him to catch up. And they would hunt. He would never participate in the hunt, but they would always share their prey with him. And that is also super unusual in the animal kingdom, where often if there's a weak or injured individual, they get abandoned and left behind. And killer whales don't do that. So they took care of him, and he lived until he was 16 years old. And he would have died at a year or two easily without the care and the support of his family. So things like that give us incredible insights into how their society works.
Scoliosis, for those of you who don't know, is a spinal curvature, and it's something that humans get too, I can tell you. Let's turn it over to audience questions, and I'm going to roam around, and I'll start right here. If you could stand up and speak into the mic.
Hi, my question is, do you have any hope that AI may help with understanding language?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot being done with AI and trying to sort of break the code of whale speak. It takes a lot of human annotated data to teach machines how to decipher this kind of thing. So right now for killer whales, we're kind of at the point where hydrophones are able to auto-detect when they're hearing killer whales, but not necessarily to the point of specific call types. So I think that's something that may be coming in the future. But it's something that they're a little further along on looking at humpback whale and sperm whale vocalizations. And it's maybe giving some insight into how they structure their communication systems. But I still think context-wise that we're a long ways away. We talk about these individual call types, but I always remind people that's a very human category that we've put on these whales that are wired to process acoustics in a way that we can't even comprehend. So what to us sounds like a single call type might contain, a sentence or a paragraph's worth of information. And there's all these subtle nuances within a single call that could be, that we're not even paying attention to right now. So I think there will be some interesting advances there, but these guys have had, 65 million years to develop their communication system. And so I think we're a little ways off from figuring it out.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I had a question about the reproductive lifespan of the whales and whether there's a difference between the two groups.
Yeah, I didn't really talk about the life history other than mentioning it was similar to human development. So calves are born in nursing for about 2 years. They're considered juveniles until they're about 10 to 12 years old when they go through adolescence and begin to reach sexual maturity, but they're not considered fully adult until they're about 18 or 20 years old. So the prime breeding years for both males and females are their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Females then go through menopause and have many decades in some cases of post-reproductive life, which indicates again the caretaking that happens, where their role as a grandmother in caring for their grand offspring is incredibly important to the family group. So males, live anywhere kind of on average from, it varies quite a bit, from 30 to 50 years old. Females, we expect most of them to be more 60 to 80 years old in that range. So it's pretty similar between the two ecotypes, but we have had some Biggs killer whale mothers reproduce at older ages than we've ever seen in residence. And we don't know if that's just an anomaly or if there's some truth to that they maintain their reproductive capacity longer into their later years.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. I grew up here in the Southern Sound, so I used to see killer whales when we get on the boat all the time, which I think is a rarer sight in the Southern Sound than it used to be. But I have a question that's broader than just the killer whales. I think it's remarkable that the marine mammal populations have grown in Puget Sound, with the exception of the southern resident killer whales. Does this reflect an improvement overall in the quality of the environment, and we're just trying to kind of gauge precisely how we're going to relieve the stress that's on the southern residents?
Yeah, great question. So the two ecotypes of killer whales are sort of representing different branches of the ecosystem in a sense, and the success of the Biggs absolutely shows that we, in part of the Sailor Sea ecosystem, have had this amazing healthy recovery. One question that I get a lot is, but don't seals and sea lions also eat salmon? And the answer is yes, but they're very much generalists. So salmon are just one of many dozens of species that they'll consume, and so they're not reliant specifically on salmon. And so a lot of the kind of forage fish species that are doing better are also the reason we're seeing like a return of humpback whales to the region in response to herring and sand lance and those sorts of species. The salmon dependence of the southern residents is a piece of it, but I think it's a big piece because we know over 120 species feed on salmon, and so the southern residents are a little bit of the canary in the coal mine because they're so focused on Chinook salmon specifically, but it is still reflecting that we have a part of our ecosystem that's not healthy as well.
Well, this kind of ties into what you just spoke about. I was curious if any studies have been done. I know the Marine Protection Act happened back in the 70s, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and increase in population of seals and sea lions, everything kind of exploded for years following that. And, based on your graphics, your excellent graphics, thank you so much. This presentation has been awesome. What it looks like is you've got the resident whales that are just solely reliant on one type of food. You've got the bigs all of a sudden preying on these marine mammals. Isn't it possible that this could equalize a little bit because you've got more predation on, that predator that is fighting for the same food source?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. That's the hope for sure, that we've had the seal and sea lion populations are thought to be either at or above even their historic levels. And so having, I think what's playing out is what we want to play out, where in response to that super abundant prey, we have a top predator coming in, and eventually that's going to help equalize. Because of the impact pinnipeds have on salmon, just the sheer number of pinnipeds, meaning seals and sea lions, even if they're not eating exclusively salmon, they're still eating a lot of salmon biomass collectively. And in certain areas, they're kind of creating bottlenecks. So think of the sea lions on the dams in the Columbia River, or a seal will sometimes sit at a river mouth right when the smolts are outgoing and have a huge impact on a local population. And because of the impacts we know seals and sea lions are having on salmon populations, there's been pressure from some sects to cull seals and sea lions as humans. And our concern is that we're just going to end up then with potentially another endangered killer whale population by completely removing their prey source. Not to mention, seals and sea lions aren't only eating salmon, they're also eating other salmon predators as well. And so we rarely understand fully how these food webs work, and when we interfere, it usually does not go well. And so on social media, we use the hashtag bigs are the balance. Just give them a little bit of time, and I think they'll bring these seal and sea lion populations into check. And in Washington, we unfortunately don't have the best monitoring program for getting kind of annual updates on those numbers, but some of the more recent studies from BC have shown pretty dramatic declines in harbor seal numbers over the last 5 years. And I'm not surprised because we've had record numbers of these seal specialists in the area. And so I think if we, they're going to be much more efficient at removing seals from the population than we ever could. Maybe not more humane. They sometimes play with their food quite a bit, but at least more efficient in the job. And so I do think if we can have a little patience and let the ecosystem do its thing, that the bigs may ultimately help the southern residents in that regard.
I'd also like to thank you for the presentation. My question is a little broader in scope. Are we actually talking about 3 apex predators? Develops the 3rd apex predator, us, and bring to the ecosystem?
Yeah, so the question is, aren't we really balancing 3 apex predators, including humans in the mix? Absolutely, we are. We are the most difficult piece of that equation for sure. There's, like I alluded to, there's a lot of difficult discussions that need to happen around sort of the available salmon and who gets first rights to them. And we tend to talk about that among different groups of humans, but we're not really taking that ecosystem look and taking the whales into consideration there. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right that the scope needs to be broader than just the food web without humans as a component.
We're back here.
Hello, thank you again for a great presentation. I think it's very informative. My concern, well, one of my concerns, there's so many, but you mentioned about larger vessels and the ship slowdowns, which is great, which is a voluntary things with Port of Vancouver, not necessarily Robert Banks boats, but also regarding small vessels and whale watching boats. I know in the summer when the sun is up, 6 and doesn't go down to well past 8, you have groups of following these whales almost 12 hours a day constantly. What about the stress of that? Is there any encouragement to have less time of observation and let them, not be the stress of that being followed and sounds?
Yeah, whale watching vessels as of today are not allowed to view southern resident killer whales closer than half a mile in the US and not allowed to view them at all in Canada. So things have changed really dramatically from what we used to see 20 years ago. For the most part, the whale watching tours today are focused on the big killer whales and the humpback whales and both populations that are doing very well. So there's the southern residents in that respect are not being followed by small boats the way that they used to be. But there's a flip side to that coin. That's actually one of the papers that we published a couple of years ago, based again on just what we were seeing play out on San Juan Island. And that's if you take the whale watch vessels away entirely, which is basically the situation that we have now, the private recreational vessels aren't necessarily aware that there are whales in the area. And so we're actually seeing a twofold increase in the number of private vessels violating the vessel regulations now that the whale watch vessels aren't there. And it's not intentional. Nobody wants to drive over a pod of killer whales. Well, very few people do, but they're just not aware. And so we see these boats transiting at high speed. They're concerned about going from point A to point B, and they don't even realize that orcas are in the area. So what we are advocating for is allowing, 1 or 2 whale watch vessels to be on scene. They actually actively flag down private boaters, help steer them around the whales. They model the correct, viewing distances, because right now, private vessels can view southern residents in Washington state at 300 yards, but whale watching vessels cannot. And so we've kind of taken the most experienced operators at how to drive around whales out of the equation. And I think we're having some unintended consequences from that in terms of having more close calls of small boats near whales. So it's a complicated issue. I think we absolutely want to be mitigating the impacts of small vessels, but it's important to have folks on scene that kind of know where the whales are and are following them and alerting other boaters in the area to what's going on.
Hi, I would just like to start by also expressing my great appreciation for you speaking here today. My question is, you spoke about the matriarchs that have been leading the JK and L pod for a long time. You mentioned J2 Granny, and I wanted to ask, as somebody who's been able to observe these whales for so long, how has the loss of these older matriarchs like Granny, like Princess Angeline, how has that affected the social behaviors of the southern residents? I've just been able to observe them for the time I've had in the last few years, noticed a lot of changes in their social behavior as far as interacting with each other and the time that they spend in local waters, and I wanted to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, great question. A lot of people wonder if the dramatic shift in habitat usage corresponded to the death of J2 as the oldest living member of the population. And the answer to that piece of the question is that they started abandoning the Salish Sea in the summer months before Granny passed away. And so I think those changes were already in motion. I wouldn't doubt that maybe having a new whale in that leadership role might further alter it, where in kind of Granny's era, we would still see them come in and kind of do a circuit up to the Fraser River, and they would just do kind of one lap around the San Juan Islands and go back out. And we always likened it to kind of checking the fridge, like, has anyone restocked this yet? No, they haven't. Whereas now they're not making those checks in anymore. They either have hopefully found something better on the outer coast where they're now spending more of their time, or have realized that that's not a productive thing to do. And so that may have been led in part by Granny's, decades of bringing them here that time of year and wanting to see what was going on. In terms of the loss of kind of multiple older females at once, within JPOD specifically, because they're the ones we get to see the most, I agree that it's shuffled their social behavior a bit. In the early 2000s, they used to travel in their matrilines very consistently, where it would be that either grandmother or mother figure and all of her offspring. And, we'd have the J14s pass line kill, followed by the J17s, followed by the J22s. And what we see now is without those, the moms and grandmothers are kind of the social glue. Without them, they're still traveling as a pod, as J-pod, but we're seeing a lot more association between similar age sex classes. So we have all the young females hanging out together and all the young males hanging out together, and they're not staying in their distinct matrilines as much. And I think that has a lot to do with the death of some of those key individuals within J-pod.
I have a question here. Sorry, I have to stand up, I guess. Thank you for the data, particularly that you provided in this presentation, which is very informative. I'm curious about one thing, that one of the apex predators is humans, as you point out. And we've had apex predators living here for thousands of years in the indigenous population. Clearly, they must have some insights into the behaviors and many things related to, and we know in their artwork that they do. Can you comment on how you're researching what the indigenous, the natural population, human population has come to know and what it contributes to our understanding?
Yeah, I certainly can't speak of the indigenous knowledge, but I can speak to the Western scientific community more general, and that we definitely, as a field, have an increasing awareness of the importance of that knowledge. And there's a lot of discussions going on about how to incorporate that into the research and the management, especially of endangered species and that sort of thing. And so I agree with you that that's an untapped knowledge resource, and the indigenous communities in this area have a lot of knowledge, of course, not only of the orcas, but of the salmon runs as well, and how those can be, sustainably fished in ways that we're not doing right now. And so there's an important piece of the puzzle there that I think is just beginning to be more broadly realized.
We have time for a couple more questions, and I am trying to get to people who've had their hands up the longest, so bear with me.
Thanks, it was a great presentation. This past summer, we were lucky enough to be anchored in Thompson Sound in the Broughtons, and we watched a couple killer whales coming in following Pacific white-sided dolphins, which were herding salmon in, and it was incredibly exciting, and they used our boat as an echolocation blind to get their prey. But off in the distance were a couple of humpbacks, and they didn't seem to be interfering or even actively watching. They were maybe a quarter mile away. Can you comment on whether the media's had things about humpbacks interfering with orcas feeding? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, humpbacks, even 20 years ago, we didn't really have humpbacks here. They were hunted to local extinction about 100 years ago, and it's only in the last 15 years or so we've seen this humpback come back, in part because of their prey returning, and also as kind of pioneering whales that have rediscovered this area have had calves and brought their calves here and so on. And that is another factor that changes the dynamics for orcas in this region, because humpbacks, and this is something that's kind of debated as to why they do this, but they are known in populations all throughout the world to interfere with killer whale attacks on other marine mammals. And it's a question of, is this true altruism? Is this misplaced altruism? Is it just posturing so that, hey, know we're in the area and we don't like you? And it's something that we see here locally sometimes, but it's certainly not always. Like you said, sometimes humpbacks are nearby and don't intervene. It may be specific that certain humpbacks do it and others don't, but we do see humpbacks in our local waters here come in and try and interrupt sea lion hunts. There was a rare minke whale hunt last year, and a humpback tried to interfere with that as well. I shared a post on social media about that story, and somebody commented saying, "We don't deserve humpbacks," and so we don't. They're the gentle giants of the sea for sure. So, but it's very little studied, and we don't know why sometimes they do and sometimes they don't.
Thanks again for your wonderful presentation. Several years ago, I was able to be a participant in a group of researchers and other people involved in the health of the Salish Sea in regards to preparing for an oil spill in the Sound, somewhere where it might impact our things in a really severe way. So one of the things that I remember hearing from that conversation was that there wasn't enough coordination among the different agencies. And then you talked about training. And then the third thing is the lack of a presence of a towing vessel that might take some kind of larger vessel that was in trouble away from the rocks. Have there been any improvements? Because it's been about a decade since that last meeting.
Yeah, there has been some improvements in terms of different agencies talking to each other. There's the creation of a task force with representatives from these different groups, and so everyone's aware of sort of what the chain of command would be, and who would be on scene first and that sort of thing. And so there's been some advancement there. The other thing that has happened in terms of preparedness, killer whales are a fantastic species for many reasons, obviously, but their ability to sort of be a face for a lot of these different issues. And so there's some, state level legislation regarding oil spill prevention that had been on the table for decades that finally crossed the finish line once the southern resident piece got brought to the attention of the legislators, because nobody wants to be in office and be responsible for the extinction of the southern residents, right? And so it is powerful political sway, and some of the preparedness of having some of those response vessels has happened, but there's a lot more to be done in terms of we might have one or two of those boats now, but think of the area that they need to cover and how it might take them days to get where they need to be and that sort of thing, and the other response equipment. So it is inching in the right direction, and there are some positive conversations happening, but it's a scary prospect still for sure.
And our last question, let me apologize to those of you I didn't get to, but we are getting close on time.
Thank you. We're from Canada, and you touched on something I'd like to pose. It was in an article that came out just last week about the same problems we're having up in the Sound area with the resident orcas and the bigs. And your figures are almost exactly the same, so it's obviously a shared problem. But one thing you touched on in your presentation was the role that genetics has been playing in terms of the decline of the southern residents, and that it may in fact be irreversible. And you showed that slide of the number of miscarriages on the southern orcas versus the bigs. I'm thinking, first of all, is that a valid criticism? And secondly, is there a certain level beyond which, if you drop below that level, the group will eventually go extinct, and what can be done to remedy that?
Yeah, great questions. First, regarding the figure about the number of miscarriages, I think potentially inbreeding and low genetic diversity could be playing a role in that. We do know from studies that have linked the kind of the pregnancy status of the whales that there is also a direct correlation to nutritional status. And so I think the ability to carry pregnancy to term is probably more due to prey than to genetics. And we saw that with the boom year in 2015, where there was more fish and we had 11 calves born. But overall, the small breeding population is definitely a concern, and there's been some recent publications looking at inbreeding depression in southern resident killer whales. And the effects are relatively small, but it does show that when whales are more inbred, their likelihood of surviving to age 40 drops. And so that means they're either not reaching reproductive age or not reproducing for their full potential, and that's certainly not a great thing. And we know from some of the focused genetic studies that have happened on southern residents that we have some very direct inbreeding that has happened between mothers and sons and fathers and daughters and that sort of thing. So it's not great, and it's one of those factors that we don't really have any control over because we can't, introduce a attractive Biggs killer whale to the population and inject some new genetic diversity because they're already encountering other orcas and not choosing to outbreed with those populations, and so their cultures are just so restrictive in that sense. But one thing that is true for killer whales around the world is they're all fairly small breeding populations. We're 75 whales is very small, but even 600 whales in the Biggs killer whale populations is very small compared to many other species that we're talking about. And as new studies are progressing, we're learning that killer whales may have some unique mechanisms for dealing with low genetic diversity that might help them mitigate some of the impacts of inbreeding since they're found in these small populations all throughout the world. And so that research will be super interesting to see that maybe inbreeding won't affect them to the degree that it does in other mammalian populations. But it's definitely a concern. There's certainly a point of no return where you don't have enough breeding individuals left. And for a while, our concern was that there weren't going to be enough breeding females because for many years there was a male-biased sex ratio among the calves being born into the population. But thankfully, over the last decade, that seems to have lessened and we're getting a lot more female calves again. And so as long as there are female calves, there's the potential for future reproduction. And there's, I find a lot of hope in that. But it's hard to know where that breaking point is where there's just not enough of them to recover.
Monica, thank you. This has been a wonderful, informative program. Can we have a round of applause for Monica? As a thank you to Monica, we have a little gift certificate from Village Books. And speaking of which, we have Monica's books over there. Can you stay for a few minutes to sign books?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And just ask to thank you, and also if everybody would help clean up. There are some waste baskets over there if you could bust your tables. And again, thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming.